Welcome. I'm Cindy Mitchell. I think I know most of you. I'm chairman of the Up Island Council on Aging Board of Directors. And thank you for coming. I'm going to introduce our speaker and hand it right over to her. So, Caitlin Coyle, directs the Research Center at the Gerontology Institute at the University of Mass, Boston. Dr. Coyle and her group have worked with dozens of councils on aging across the state to engage their communities in the similar process of collecting comprehensive and objective information that can guide COA and the town as it considers the needs and the values of its older residents.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Cynthia. Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Okay. Thank you, Bethany. If I start to wane at any point, just wave at me and I will do my best to project. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful afternoon. We are being recorded for the public access television station, so that's very exciting for people who couldn't be here this afternoon. I am here to present the results of the needs assessment that we've been working on over the last year-ish. And so I'm excited to be here to share some of that. There is sort of a summary of that report on the back table. You can also request full copies of the full report if you would like one. I know Beth at the Council on Aging and others can get us those reports. It is lengthy. And so I encourage you to, when you have time, to review it. But so today, I say that because today I'm really going to hit the highlights. I'm going to just give us some of the highlights of the findings, but the report is very rich and has lots of additional information in it. So, to start, I wanted to thank a few people. Primarily the Council on Aging, the Up Island Council on Aging, the Board of Directors, Beth Kramer and others, as well as the towns of Aquinnah, Chilmark, and West Tisbury for committing to doing this work. Bethany Hammond at the Up Island Council on Aging and her staff for helping us along the way. And perhaps most importantly, I want to thank all of the residents of the 3 towns of these communities for taking the time to complete a survey, come to a focus group, show up here. This work is only as good as the input we have from the communities, and here we were pretty successful with respect to getting some good information. So I wanted to thank people for their input before we get into it. I also included just a little bit of a history, very loose history here, of the Up Island Council on Aging and the House and sort of how we arrived at this needs assessment place, which is just going back to the 1970s when the Up Island Council on Aging was established and located in the House in West Tisbury. In 2021, there was a feasibility committee established for the House, and there were focus groups conducted with Healthy Aging Martha's Vineyard with respect to that feasibility study committee. In 2023, there were draft renovation and expansion plans assembled and discussions with the Historic District Commission and the recommendation and the sort of recognition of a need for organizational updates and building updates at House. In 2024, there was a new director hired. The Up Island Council on Aging also had lots of new membership, new bylaws, all of that sort of fresh faces, fresh perspectives. And with that, the Up Island Council on Aging formed a facilities and strategic planning subcommittee, which found us essentially at UMass. So to inform that strategic planning and that sort of facility subcommittee, they found us and invited us to conduct this needs assessment, really, which is meant to inform the strategic planning of the Up Island Council on Aging as it considers moving forward, the things that they should prioritize, how to respond to the needs of the communities, et cetera. And so that brings us to where we are today, which is that comprehensive needs assessment is complete. The report has been delivered, and the recommendations, which I'll share a little bit about this evening, are in the hands of the Up Island Council on Aging for moving forward. So this needs assessment was done in part because of that Up Island Council on Aging subcommittee, but also because of general trends that we know about with respect to people wanting to age in place, people wanting to age in their communities, and the fact that there is a large and growing older adult population really all over the world, but that's true here also in the 3 communities of Up Island. With that, we also recognize that there are shifting and diverse needs of that population. So when we talk about the 60-plus population, that's 3 to 5 generations of people in that age group. And those folks have different life experiences, different preferences, different needs, and all of that can inform what they're looking for and how they're participating in places like the Up Island Council on Aging. So all of those things led to the motivation for this project. And as I said, it's meant to inform the strategic planning of the Up Island Council on Aging with respect to programming and services, but also the capacity of the building, the space, and the staff of the Up Island Council on Aging, the House. I also wanted to say that before we dig into the results, that one of the approaches we took to this is that aging doesn't just happen within the 4 walls of the senior center. It affects our communities and how we live and operate in the world. And so we took that sort of wide lens to this work by asking about things like housing and transportation and health and social connection. So we believe that this information will be helpful not just to the Up Island Council on Aging, but also to the municipalities more broadly as they think about services and supports for residents at large. So what did we do? Well, just in terms of recapping what we did. So we did do a document review where we looked at the different planning reports that have been done for the 3 communities. We got annual report information from Bethany and her team about understanding the scope of services and supports that are offered at the Up Island Council on Aging. We did a series of these key informant interviews where we sat down with 11 individuals who are identified in partnership with the Up Island Council on Aging as people who have decision-making power or particular perspective on the 3 communities, who can help us understand what are the needs of older adults, but also how do those needs fit into the larger conversations that are happening in these towns. We also did 4 focus groups. 3 of those were here in person. We did 1 in each of the 3 towns back in the fall. And we also did 1 on Zoom with people who are what we consider to be sort of stakeholders, people who provide services or programs or business services to older adults on the island who can speak really to the more vulnerable segments of the community. One of the things we recognize about this work is that we are hearing from the people who are willing to be heard from, and that there are people in our community who aren't taking the survey or aren't coming to a focus group, and it's important for us to understand what their experience is. And so one of the things we do is try to engage people who do have connections with those folks. So faith communities, Meals on Wheels delivery folks, case managers, nonprofit organizations, et cetera. And so that group was held on Zoom. We also surveyed the residents 50 plus in the 3 towns. We had 691 surveys returned to us, which is a response rate of about 25%, which is very good. And so I will be sharing some results from those 691 surveys here. This is comparing the distribution of the 50 plus population across the 3 towns based on the census. So comparing that distribution to the distribution of our survey respondents. So for example, you see that 10% of the 50 plus population lives in Aquinnah when we look across these communities, or 10% of Aquinnah, is in the 50 plus population. And our survey respondents, 11% of them were from Aquinnah. So in that case, we're actually pretty representative with respect to how our survey results reflect the distribution of the 3 communities. We have 26% is the distribution in Chilmark. We have a 29% of our survey respondents are from Chilmark. 64% of the 50 plus population is in West Tisbury. We had 59% of our survey respondents from West Tisbury. So it really sort of played out quite nicely that they align pretty well with respect to how the results of the survey really reflect the distribution of the older adults across the 3 communities. We also, this is by age, so just sort of understanding who we heard from in addition to the age. So I guess some things to note is that we With respect to the age distribution across the three communities, we heard from a larger share of people in their 70s and a slightly larger share of people in their 80s. And so and I would say what's also most important about this is we have we're very underrepresented when it comes to people in their 50s when it comes to this data. So for example, 22% of the population of the three towns is between 50 and 59 years old. We only have 9% of our survey respondents in that age bracket. So as I'm presenting the results, I think it's just important to recognize that when we see things broken down by age, that there aren't as many people 50 plus or 50 to 59 in this survey data. So we just want to take that with a little bit of context. We heard from more females than males, which is not uncommon. And 1% of the survey respondents identified as being members of the Wampanoag tribe. We asked about how long people have been on Martha's Vineyard and about whether or not they live mostly year-round here on the island. You'll see in the pie chart that 32%, so about a third of our survey respondents have been here for 45 years or more. So a third been here a long time. But comparatively, we have 9% who've only been here for less than 5 years, and 12% who've been here less than 15 years. So you do have 21% of our survey respondents who are relative newcomers to the island. So I think that's important to consider. When we asked about whether they live year-round, this is by the three towns. So you see that 90% of survey respondents in West Tisbury say, yes, I live here year-round. 78% of people in Chilmark say they're here year-round, and 63% in Aquinnah say they're here year-round. So slightly different sort of distributions of seasonal population across the three communities. I also wanted to share, these are the three towns, the size of the older adult population across the three towns, and also looking backwards to 2010. So that orange line is West Tisbury. So in 2010, there was about 2,700 older adults in West Tisbury. And the projections that we have available to us say that by 2030, there will be more than 3,600 older adults in West Tisbury. And so we're seeing an increase in the older adult population specifically. We do see a similar pattern in Chilmark and Aquinnah, with going from 866 residents, older adults in 2010 to 1,400 in 2030. And in Aquinnah, 311 going up to 737. So more than a doubling, really.
I think those are total population figures.
Yes. Oh.
Not older adults, those are total population. Yeah.
Yes. So the total population, slight growth across the three communities. And when we look at where that growth is coming from, this is those three communities by age bracket. Again, the 2010, 2020, and 2030 age distributions. And what you see is that in Aquinnah by 2030, 51% of the population will be 70 and older, which is pretty stark. In Chilmark, by 2030, 36% will be 70 and older, but an additional 15%, making it over half of the community of Chilmark, will be age 60 and older by then. And in West Tisbury, we see that 37% of the population will be 60 plus by 2030, and that compares to 22%, 24% in 2010. So we see that there's a overall slight growth in the total population of people, and that growth is really coming from these older adults. And so they're continuing to make up a sizable share of the community, and we'll expect to do that in the future. So that sort of lays some of the groundwork, again, for the rationale for the work. We very quickly wanted to understand what people were concerned about when it comes to aging in place. So we had an open-ended question on the survey. People were right away asked, what are the things that concern you about being able to stay here? We coded hundreds of those responses, counted them, themed them, and what you're seeing here are the sort of top 5 things that came up in that concern, and then the yellow boxes are the quotes directly from people to describe what those needs are. So the number one most common concern is a lack of medical services, followed by cost of living, And number 3 was maintaining personal wellness and independence. And number 4 was transportation, getting where I need to go. And number 5 was the availability and accessibility of necessary services. So when my needs change, will there be services available to support me? I think with respect to the quotes, I'll let you sort of read those, but it really sort of illustrates the fact that there are not the physicians and hospitals and things that they need for people to stay here. And even some of the transportation, particularly in this part of the island, talking about a lack of reliable transportation when they want to go somewhere. And then broadly, this worry that if I'm no longer able to stay in my home, that I'll be unable to find housing with supports. So when it comes to driving, we asked survey respondents about their driving status. And what you see is that as people age, people who don't drive at all and people who limit their driving in some way increases with age. So here we see that only 4% of people in their 50s say that they do not drive at all, or they limit their driving in some way, meaning they don't drive at night or they avoid driving in unfamiliar areas, etc. That 4% grows to about 13% of people in their 70s, and it goes upwards of 39% of people in their 80s who say, including 16% of people in their 80s who say they don't drive at all, and 23% who say they limit their driving in some way. So significant shares of people in the 80 plus category who are potentially reliant on transportation options or alternatives to driving to get around. So we asked people what are the specific transportation concerns that they have. This is by driving status. So the gold bars are people who don't drive at all. And so we said among people who don't drive at all, what are their barriers to transportation? The number 1, it's sort of tied for number 1 and number 2, but number 1 is walking or biking to my destination is not safe or feasible. So for people who don't drive, walking is not perceived as being possible or safe. For those non-drivers, the other sort of main challenge is that public transportation is unavailable or inconvenient. So for people who aren't driving, their barriers are, I want to walk but I can't, or the public transportation isn't here. And then 30% say that they have physical limitations or impairments making accessing the transportation difficult. So they have transportation options, but it's physically difficult for them to find that transportation. So giving us a little bit more insight, I would also note that for people who limit their driving in some way, a similar pattern emerged, but something that stood out to me was that there was 20% of people who limit their driving who say they have no one they can depend on for a ride. So there's 20% of people who say, I'm starting to change my driving habits, and one of the challenges I'm experiencing is that if I want to go somewhere and I don't feel comfortable driving myself, I don't have someone to depend on. When we looked at, this is the share of people living alone by age category. So although most survey respondents reported living with at least one other person, when we look at it by age, we see an increasing rate of living alone by age, including 34% of people in their 80s say they're living alone. And so when we think about what that means for what people might need to be able to be successful as they age, thinking about the levels of social support is going to be important. We had questions about, do you feel like you have the money, the finances to meet your basic needs? So it was a very sort of broad question about, do you feel like you have what you need to get by financially? And in the whole sample, we saw pretty low rates of people saying that they had financial concerns, but when we looked at whether people live alone or live with others, we saw some differences in the sense of compared to people who live with other people. So among people who live with someone, 13% said, no, I don't have what I need to get by. That's compared to 28% of people who live alone, who say, 28% of people who live alone say, I don't have the finances to meet my basic needs. So really kind of thinking about, again, sort of the vulnerabilities that come with living alone, being financially insecure, and what that means for what people need to age well. The other thing we saw was that, especially among the people in their 50s and 60s, half of them report either currently or in recent years providing care to someone who is frail or disabled. So 50% of people in their 50s and 50% of people in their 60s, as well as about 40% of people in their 70s and 80s, say that they have been a caregiver either now or in the last couple of years. Sometimes I think caregiving can go sort of invisible on us, and we don't remember that people are dealing with families and friends and neighbors and things like that. And so I think it's just an important thing to recognize. Among them, we asked a couple of questions about how difficult it was for them, et cetera. And one of the things we wanted to share was this idea of 36% of caregivers said that their social life has deteriorated because of their care provision. Meaning that as they're providing care to someone, they're giving up sort of social connection, as well as, certainly 23%, 28% of them said that their mental health is deteriorated, and 27% say that their physical health has deteriorated. So for people who are in this caregiving role, really thinking about how to support them as they age will be a priority. We asked them what they would benefit from. So caregivers, what are the kinds of things that you would need or want? 40% said that they would like, what would have made them their experience better, would have been more valuable to them is more formal in-home caregiver or homemaking services, followed by informal support from family and friends. And 32% are looking for on-call support from a medical professional. So people are looking for help, real tangible help, either in-home paid help, help from family and friends, or being able to pick up the phone and get some advice sort of on the spot. And so thinking about how to, what that means for the services of Up Island Council on Aging is something to consider. We also heard a bit about this sort of not knowing what's going on, not being aware of the programs and services that are available to folks. So we asked, this is the percentage of people who say, I do not know who to contact for help if me or someone in my family needs help accessing to social services. So 39% of people in their 50s say they don't know who to contact. 34% of people in their 60s and 22% of people in their 70s say, I don't know who to contact in town if I needed help accessing social services. We did look at this by whether or not they live here year-round versus not, and we did see some differences there. So we see higher rates of not knowing among people who live elsewhere part of the year, which makes some sense. But still 21% of people who live here year-round say they don't know who to contact if they needed help accessing social services. So this final section is really about the Up Island Council on Aging and with specifics about people's interactions with the COA. The line graph here is rates of participation by age. So this is have you ever been? This is not do you come every day. This is have you ever been to House? Have you ever been to the Council on Aging, yes or no? So we see that 24% of people in their 50s say yes, I've been there. 21% of people in their 60s. And then we see a pretty significant spike up when it comes to people in their 70s and 80s, with 58% of respondents in their 80s saying yes, I've gone to House before. However, when we ask them about how frequently they go to House, which is the pie chart you see here, we see that 71% of them who've ever been only go once a year, or a few times a year, I should say, for special events. And then we see, a smattering, 4% go a couple times a week, 11% go, so about 15% go weekly, and about 15% go once a month or more. But still, a large share of people who've ever been to House have only come a few times a year for special events. So just important to think about as I show some results about what people are looking for and all of that, that the varied relationship with House is certainly here, in the mix. And there's no value judgment to that, by the way. It's really just that people have different relationships with the Council on Aging in terms of what brings them there, what they like to do, what they're looking for, what they need. But I think it's an important dynamic to recognize that the Council on Aging is trying to serve this big, diverse group of people, and some people might come once a month, and that's wonderful, and they're satisfied with that, versus people who come every day. And so it's just recognizing that there's a lot of variety with respect to what a user looks like at the house. So we asked what would make it more likely for them to come to the Council on Aging. Number one, really across the board, is that they would be more likely to use the Council on Aging if they had more knowledge about programs and services available. So people want to know what's available, and that would make them more likely to come if they had a better understanding of what goes on. Number two, sort of the numbers, interestingly, was other, and people wrote in their own comments about what that means, what would make them more likely to come. So when we looked at that, the write-in explanations for what would make them more likely to come really circled around this idea of, I don't need to come. I'm not old enough, I don't have a need, my health is good, I'm really busy, this kind of thing, or I don't have time, I'm too busy to come. So it was kind of around this perception that you have to have a need to come to the Council on Aging, that it's not a place where anybody can come to participate in programming, but it's really that there's a perception that there needs to be a need demonstrated, which I think is interesting to think about. So the quote we pulled out to represent that, someone says, I think of COA providing services to the elderly, but at 68, I don't feel I'm there yet. So there's just a lot of people who say, I don't need to go there. I would be more likely to go if I had a need. We asked about what kinds of programs, so we separated programs and services from one another. We asked about programs. What kind of programs would you like to see more of? And this is comparing people who've never been to the Council on Aging, people who attend a few times a year, which is that lighter blue, and then people who come at least once a month, so kind of a more regular participant. That's the darkest blue. So we saw sort of this clustering up at the top in terms of the sort of most frequently selected programs to have more of. Number one across the board was lectures, guest speakers, and cultural events. And that was followed by indoor fitness and educational courses and programming. So the examples there are foreign languages, bird watching, et cetera. So people want to learn. They want to be engaged intellectually, and they also want sort of this opportunity for indoor fitness. I will say that when we look at differences between users and non-users, we see some differences down there at the bottom with respect to people who come regularly are more inclined to want technology skills classes, social gatherings, and off-island trips. So there is a slight difference, but when it comes to sort of the most frequent, there was sort of a similar trend across the user groups with respect to that, lectures, guest speakers, lifelong learning, and indoor fitness. So when it comes to services, what do people want more, what kind of services more do people want? Again, we looked at it across the user groups, and we see transportation to medical appointments being the top, and professional services like tax prep and health insurance counseling. And number three, we see transportation to medical appointments on island. So again, this transportation to medical appointments, whether it's here on the island or off island, is something that people across, whether they use the COA very often or not, is something that people are looking for. And again, we see some differences with respect to current users. The thing that I wanted to mention about that was the idea that people who participate at the Council on Aging currently have a higher preference for food programming, grab and go and on-site meals. So down here at the bottom, between grab and go and on-site meals, we saw big differences between people who are currently coming to the Up Island Council on Aging versus not. So we asked about the sort of structural aspects of the Council on Aging in terms of how to make programs and services more accessible to everyone. And we asked people to prioritize these things, so things that were high priority, medium priority, et cetera. And having free Wi-Fi access was rated as a high priority by 37% of survey respondents. Coming in sort of second were these two things. One, parking, ample and accessible parking, and also no or little cost to programs. So 21% of survey respondents said that we need to have lots of ample parking and no or little cost to programs and free Wi-Fi. Interesting to me. We sort of pondered over this free Wi-Fi thing. And I think it is about the actual Wi-Fi, but I also think it's about this general sense of people want to go places where they can be connected, and just a reminder of how important that is for people. So we also asked people about their preferences for how services and programs are provided at House House. So currently, we're trying to get people to think about sort of, does the way that programs and services are provided through House House, is that working? Or do you have preferences for other ways, in terms of where programming is held, et cetera? So we gave them these sort of three scenarios and asked them to rate their preference. The first is to sort of the current operations, which is that most of the programs are provided primarily at House House with offerings in Aquinnah and Chilmark, which is sort of the current operations. We also asked them about having the programs and services held in a different dedicated building, so similar structure but not at House House, so a dedicated building with programs and services, or with programs at satellite locations in Aquinnah, Chilmark, and West Tisbury. And then we also asked us about, would you like programs and services to just be offered sort of at this satellite structure? We saw the most preference for the current operations of people, so 41% of people in Aquinnah, 58% of people in Chilmark, 67% of people in West Tisbury said they want the current, most things happening at House House with some satellite programming as well. I will say the thing that strikes me about this figure is the brown boxes at the top, which are the rates of people who say, I don't know. So 39% of people in Aquinnah, 25% of people in Chilmark, and 19% of people in West Tisbury don't have an answer to this question. They don't know. And I think that's true even more so when we talk about the possibilities. So, in terms of option number 2, 44% of people in Aquinnah, 36% of people in Chilmark, and 31% of people in West Tisbury say, I don't know. So there's a lot of I don't know out there, which I think is an important thing to think about as we plan for the future and how we're going to do the strategic planning moving forward. We also asked people about their appetite, their interest in an Up Island multi-generational community center or an island-wide senior center. And we see a similar result in that there's a lot of people that don't know. But when it comes to if a multi-generational community center was developed Up Island, how likely would it be that you or a member of your household would use it? In Aquinnah, 57% said very or somewhat likely. They would be very or somewhat likely to use a multi-generational community center Up Island. 56% of people in Chilmark said they would be very or somewhat likely to participate. And 45% of people in West Tisbury said they would be very or somewhat likely to participate if that multi-generational community center was developed in this area. You also see about a third across those three communities of people who say they are unsure about that. When we asked about the island-wide senior center, community center, so if something like that was developed, how likely would it be for you to participate? And here we saw a similar pattern of results across town, and where we saw some differences was around the age group. So we found that among the people 50 to 59, 64% said they would be very or somewhat likely to use an island-wide community center. 41% of people in their 60s, 48% of people in their 70s, and 38% of people in their 80s say they would be very or somewhat likely to use an island-wide community center. But again, we see 34%, 41%, lots of people who say they are unsure about this. And then you see, in terms of percentage of people who say that they would be very unlikely to use that, we see the rates of very or somewhat unlikely to be highest among people in their 80s. So here, my takeaway is that there is some openness to talking about, a multi-generational community center, Up Island, or an island-wide senior center, island-wide community center, but there are lots of people who are still very unsure. And so additional public conversation and engagement is necessary to make those decisions, but certainly something to discuss. So we have a number of, we sort of summarized the key findings and then provided some recommendations. I'm not going to read all of these to you, so I'm just going to sort of hit on sort of the highlights. So when we think about the priority areas, which I'll end on, these are sort of the things we pulled out as things to really be chewing on as we think about strategic planning. So number one is transportation. It's limited, particularly in this part of Martha's Vineyard. It's a challenge to aging in place, and this is particularly true for people who live alone or have mobility limitations. And so really when we think about the transportation options, it's about, do they operate in this part of the area, and do they meet the needs of people who have physical mobility challenges? We also recognize that the risk for social isolation and what that comes with, and loneliness, is high here on the island. And that is true lots of places, but there was just sort of this idea of, both because of the built environment and also the social environment, that there is a risk for people to fall into isolation, and really how important it is to maintain those social networks as people age and change. So we give some ideas about how to think about continuing to do that. This idea of caregiving being really common, particularly among people in their 50s and 60s, and that these families could use support. So recognizing, number one, just recognizing that that's happening for a lot of people, and what kinds of supports they might be looking for, and thinking about how to provide services not just to the caregiver, but to the person who needs the care. So those were sort of like the big picture, community-wide takeaways: transportation, caregiving, social isolation. When it comes to the Up Island Council on Aging specifically, we have a series of sort of findings and recommendations, one of which is that it's very clear that the Up Island Council on Aging is an asset to residents who are wishing to age well. So people who want to age well, the Up Island Council on Aging people really value it. However, its capacity to serve the growing and diverse needs and preferences of older adults is limited by its physical space. So this idea that people want indoor fitness, they want lectures, they want programs, they want a lifelong learning, and that the current space needs don't allow for people to be able to do that in large numbers. We also learned that a lot of older adults are not aware of the full range of offerings. So this idea that if I had more knowledge, if I knew what was going on, I would be more likely to come. And so thinking about, and also this perception that I mentioned about people feeling like they have to have a need to come to the Council on Aging, I have to be in need to participate. So talking about that as an area for thinking about how do we message the Council on Aging, how do we encourage this sort of positive, engaged, sort of, they call it sort of reframing aging, that kind of thing. So there's some examples and recommendations about how to increase awareness and sort of change the message. People want these, as I mentioned, they want indoor exercise, they want intellectual stimulation, with some different priorities from those who have limited or no engagement with the Council on Aging. So we did see some of those differences, for example, mentioning that people who come to the Council on Aging regularly are more likely, they want the more food options, they want the grab and go or the meals. So there's some differences, but broadly speaking, people want this intellectual stimulation and indoor fitness. So this is a sort of a carryover of that, really recognizing there's sort of the programmatic side of how do we meet that need, but there's also the capacity side of how do we meet that need with respect to staff. So if we expect that people will continue to age here and want to participate in these kinds of things, how can we be prepared to receive them? That's going to require sort of the thinking on the programming side, but also in terms of the building and the staff. How do we make that happen? We also talk about another sort of section of recommendations around this need is about the partnerships that are required to meet these these needs with respect to public-private relationships, cross-departmental relationships, really basically saying it's not only on the Council on Aging to do all of this, that they are one among municipal departments and bodies that more working together, both within the towns but also across the island, can strengthen communication, it can strengthen access to programming, even among the other councils on aging here. How do we work together to make more available to people? So this is a lot of information. This is only a little bit of it, actually. But I wanted to end on, we sort of have these, thinking about how do we move this forward? What are the next steps? And we sort of propose focusing on sort of these recommendations with respect to how the Up Island Council on Aging moves forward. Number one is to expand efforts to provide programs and services in Aquinnah and Chilmark. This is already happening, but making sure that it continues to happen and thinking about ways to even expand it so that people in all three towns, and one of the things we heard qualitatively, and you all know this, is just that it's a lot harder for people in Aquinnah and Chilmark to get to West Tisbury, to the Council on Aging. And so thinking about that, thinking about implementing how do we implement programs that really support the active, healthy aging goals of older adults and make sure we're thinking about lifelong learning and that indoor fitness that people are looking for. We also say to prioritize the remessaging of efforts of the Up Island Council on Aging with respect to sort of breaking down any stereotypes that exist in terms of people feeling like they belong there or they should go. And then continuing to convene the leaders of the three communities to create a set of objectives for the Up Island Council on Aging space. So this idea that you have three towns working together to provide these programs and services through House and really making sure that that communication is there and that there's a shared understanding of what should be going on with that space. And in that same vein, this idea of recognizing that there have been, I started by talking about the brief history here, and so building on those previous efforts to generate plans for the space. And we recommend really thinking about convening a new building committee to say, okay, we've gone out into the community, we've heard from people, we have this information, we're thinking about this holistically, comprehensively, and with people involved, let's think about how we move forward with the building from here on out. And really thinking about the fact that all possible solutions are on the table, and thinking about the fact that this could mean other locations. It may or may not include the House location. So really recommending a fresh start when it comes to thinking about the building, given that you've done all this community engagement, you've got a holistic strategic plan ahead of you, and really thinking about what's possible, really. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, comments, reactions, discussion. I was saying to Beth, this sort of concludes our formal relationship with the Up Island Council on Aging, but certainly, we do this work all over the state, and we are happy to continue the conversation about how this moves forward and be supportive in any way that we can. So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
The question is that sitting here, that as the issue of seniors who are old, like I'm in my 90s, who are old but are in good shape,
Yeah.
are very fit, to create a source of, that they could create for themselves an additional source of income, seeing what we are facing right now for the financial difficulty that we are entering right now. If they're able and they have the intelligence and they're prepared to do it, to work,
Yeah.
they might welcome that.
Yes, very good point. So the comment is this idea of how do we connect residents who are able and interested in employment and working in some capacity with those opportunities, especially recognizing just the general financial insecurity that we face as in retirement by having a fixed income, but the additional pressure of the economic situation in our country. So thinking about what kinds of employment or paid opportunities do older adults have. Very good idea, good example. Other thoughts or questions? Yes. Yes.
And do you break down when you know, sometimes you're asking a question and the following question's kind of a subset, and do you have like the count?
Yeah.
What percentage of respondents answered that particular question? Because sometimes 30%, but it was only
Right.
10 people that responded. It's helpful to know what your N is.
Yeah, so in the full report, there's a mix of every survey question by age with the way that people responded. I'm not sure there's ends in there, but there is, but we can make that available to you. Yep. Yes, Bethany.
About the slides. If people sign up on the sign-in sheet and leave their email, we will send the slides, the
Yep.
full report, summary, anything you'd like. We can email that right to you.
Wonderful.
Just make sure we have that on the layer.
Yes. Oops.
Yes, this report.
Yes, it's also being recorded on the public access cable channel. But yes, if you want copies, put your email on the list and we can send those to you. And the slides will also be part of the video as well. Yes, sir.
Your statistics, I mean, all the graphs up there are hard to digest.
Sure.
But the statistics are all based on who responded to the survey.
Correct.
So I'm one of those people who did not respond. And among my friends, as we sit around and talk, I don't think any of them responded either. So how do you deal with the kind of unspoken need out there of the people who didn't even know there was a survey or didn't care about it, or say, I would never go to the Council on Aging. I don't think they do anything that works for me. And so
Yeah.
I have a significant group of friends who are 80 who would fit into that category.
Yeah. It's a good point. I will say a couple things. One, we mailed the survey to everyone age older who is registered to vote in the town. So not knowing about it, not really an excuse, in my opinion, unless you don't check your mail. So we did our best and we really invested in that. And I think the Council on Aging really wanted to make sure that we are exactly what you're saying, hearing from people who are not participating. And so that's why we took that effort to make sure that it went to everyone. So that's one piece. So the people who responded, as I said, I mean, a number of them have never even been to the Council on Aging. And so we have that. But I think that the broader question of how do you deal with people who don't identify, and I think we see a lot of that in the data. I mean, we see a lot of people saying, I don't know, I don't have an opinion about this, I never go, this kind of thing. And I think that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, part of what this is about too is that the Council on Aging isn't necessarily have to be for everyone, either, but recognizing what people, this is really about what people want and need. And so if you don't want or need anything, I guess.
There may be another way to reach.
I think that
Well, we're not going to shame you publicly, but yeah. Yes.
I know that something arriving from the Council on Aging in our house was not the open. We're overwhelmed. Like, we are triaging, and I get an email. But I did respond. But I don't think, I guess I'm wondering, I don't think decisions necessarily should be made
Sure.
based on respondents as
Sure.
opposed to also acknowledging, especially when you find out what percentage of each town responded.
Yeah.
Sure. I think conversations matter. And just to put that out there, I do think.
Of course. No, I actually think that that's one of the most important parts of what we learned in this process is that those conversations matter. And it's really important that people who come to the Council on Aging and don't come to the Council on Aging are part of those conversations. And this work is really meant to be the launching place of planning. So decisions are not being made based on this data alone. This is meant to sort of put some stakes in the sand and say this is where we're headed kind of thing. Beth would like to add to
So
that.
just, I mean, you're right, and without public input.
Yes.
And lots of conversation, but this is, just as Kate said, this is a starting point.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a great starting point, and the fact that you got 25%, I mean, it would have been great if we had 100%.
Sure.
But that didn't happen, so this is one of many, many opportunities.
Yes.
It's the beginning.
It's the beginning. And I also will, to those 2 points, I think the other thing that comes up in this recommendation of sort of remessaging, rebranding, how do we talk, it is this idea that people get something from the Council on Aging and they put it in the trash because that's not for them. No matter how old they are, it's not for them. It's never going to be for them. And so it is sort of also reinforces this idea that there's an opportunity if we have this resource, this asset that can really enhance people's lives as they get older and stay healthy and independent. How do we maximize that asset? And part of that might be about investing in branding or marketing or there's lots of talk these days about eliminating ageism. And, I always say the biggest perpetrators of ageism are ourselves on ourselves in terms of how we think about our own aging and are not identifying with it. Yes, in the back.
I would like to applaud everyone that made the effort to get this survey out in the mail and in person and standing on the street in front of our office. But I would also like to point out to everybody, can you tell me honestly, what percentage do we get going to town meetings? Oh, barely a quorum. We're sitting there calling people because you only get 10% of your voters. How many people go to the polls to vote? So this is not specific just to us. This is a new, I don't know the answer. I'd like to say it to you, but there are things much more. I mean, you couldn't advertise town meetings and politics more than are advertised.
Right.
And they don't get any more response than we do.
Yeah.
We did better than they did.
We did. We did do better. Yeah, well, and I think you're right. There is and it's because I'm not a marketing person, but I understand that part of it is about getting the message out, but part of it is also making sure that the message is ready to be received on the other end, right? So you can push a survey about the Council on Aging out, you could spend dollars doing that, and there are still going to be people who aren't going to respond to it because it's about the Council on Aging and they don't see themselves in that. Same thing with, voting. People, if it's not directly, if they don't perceive it to be directly impactful, then they're not less likely to engage. Yes.
Caitlin, you just mentioned you could spend millions of dollars. I think what is suggested by all of the work that you've done is that there are a bunch of things that can be addressed by some creative thinking, rethinking the way things are moving and so forth. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that really requires a completely different level of funding.
Yes.
Looking at the obvious and inevitable increase in demand for services and the increase of cost of providing them, and also the consequences of making things open for funding from other sources, all of the state funding, or regional funding, or other thing that may be available, or private funding, or an endowment,
Right.
that all come with certain strings. And so this is one of the things that I think that when you look at priorities, this is what we have to be weighing and have to be keeping that in mind all the way
Yes.
through.
Yes. And I imagine in the strategic planning, and I think the way the report laid out is that there's lots of things that can be done in relative short term with some creative thinking, et cetera. But the question is, if you build it, will they come? And if they come, will you be ready for them? And those are those sort of longer term questions that have to also be dealt with in this process. Yes?
I happen to believe that there are a lot of people who would use it,
Yeah.
I mean, I really do. And I have to defend my friend Warren.
Yeah.
On Council on Aging. And through that, I have gained so much knowledge, so, now I'm invested.
Right.
And it's that, that is what...
The entry point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I was one of those ones that wouldn't come to this,
Yeah.
and now, I'm invested, I come, I'm interested, I want it to happen, and we need to find
So find ways to make that entry point available, exactly, make that similar entry point or a type of entry point more widely available. So maybe it's not that you come to programming, maybe it's that you volunteer to do an event once in a while, and by that you get to know the people on the board, you understand, you get a closer look at what's going on, or you can get yourself in the door.
Well, you know, it's improving transportation for older people so that they tell two friends and
Right.
those two, you know, it's those small steps that we could take
Yeah.
pretty easily.
Yeah.
And then from there it would, I mean, in my happy life, it would expand, you know, exponentially to
Yeah.
everyone in the community.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think about, I think in Boston they're doing this, but this idea of like, almost like ambassadors of, you know, people who know a lot about what's going on, they love it, and they're out there sort of telling their friends and inviting people to come and making sure that there's kind of always, what do they call that, influencing? That's what we can do, you could get some influencers maybe, some interns, I don't know, could work. Was there other questions, thoughts? Yes.
I just wanted to comment on the transportation
Yes.
discussion. So I'm Cindy Trish, and I'm with Healthy Aging, and we convene a coalition of about 15 agencies, including the Council on Aging, around older adult transportation. And I have to say that Up Island has some very, very unique challenges around transportation. Our 6 programs that we rolled out, including Go-Go Grandparents, someone made a comment, provided almost 10,000 rides to older adults last year. That's, but the percentage of those rides that occurred Up Island was significantly lower relative to the number of older adults Up Island. The COA at Up Island, House, we just rolled out a shuttle program to pick people up at their homes one day a week and take them shopping. And we have just rolled out a volunteer driver transportation program so that we aren't getting the blowback from Uber and Lyft drivers who don't want to come up to Aquinnah. So my point of telling you all this is there's a lot of energy around transportation, and it is endless, the need for transportation.
Yeah.
What I find unique about Up Island, and I think is going to require some different and more creative and collaborative thinking, is you've got 3 towns that are geographically distant from other elements of the island, and there's got to be more synergy in terms of thinking about these, these solutions. So we're very aware that the Up Island communities are not as well served as the rest of the community in terms of transportation. My question to you is really, we're such a unique environment on this island, 6 towns, a relatively small population. I know it doesn't feel that way to us, especially in the summer, but that creates a lot of challenges in terms of economy of scale, in terms of investment and getting the maximum return we can for what we're investing in our COAs. I'm curious, so I don't know how many of you have gone to the State of Falmouth COA, which is absolutely an amazing building, but it has 8,000 older adults in Falmouth visited each year. So that ability for programming, for infrastructure, all those things make a difference based on the size of your community. So I think the opportunity here, which is so exciting about this, is to how can we leverage economy of scale? How can we, without losing the sense of who we are in each of our communities? Because this is a huge part of the challenge, is what we can afford to do, and how we're doing it as carefully as we as we can.
Yeah.
So, the other comment I just want to make is, to me, it's so much about relevance. Okay, you talk about the branding part of it, and I say you drive until you don't. And so this concept of, we talked about gateway activities and making things more relevant to people sooner, and I think you did a great job of kind of showing where some of those opportunities were.
Yeah.
But I think we have seen consistently, this is not for me.
Yes.
And I think there are examples in the broader world, and we would love to hear your opinion on it, maybe not tonight, of situations where that this is not for me has been turned into, oh, this is something I'm interested in either now or I can see how I'm going to use it. The last comment I make is the 50 to 59 data is really interesting because our experience with our data, and I think it is here, Oftentimes, it's the 50-year-old who is supporting an 80-year-old
Yes.
parent. So they're at the senior center, and Bethany and you could write the books on this, but, not necessarily for them, but for, a family member. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so that becomes a gateway in itself,
Yeah.
but it also becomes, this is where, I go when I get really old, So I think there's so many things we can do
Yes.
on the relevance front
Yes.
that this unpacks.
Yes.
That provides a lot of opportunity.
Yes, all very good points, well said, and I agree that I think about the relevance piece, and I love this idea of gateway opportunities, gateway places where we can meet people where they are and make them also aware of what's available to them and how else we can sort of identify with where they are in their life. And then I think to your point about economies of scale, I mean, absolutely, transportation is not only a problem in Up Island, as you say, you're working on this island-wide, and there's a lot of opportunities for thinking about it, and we make some recommendations about how can we think about the other aging services on the island, and how do we coordinate, and how do we support one another, and think about if I really need a good shine counselor, maybe that's in a different town, but that's okay, and how do we make that sort of cross-border kind of things more common and sort of more easily accessible.
I can't say enough about Cindy.
I know.
And what they have done for us to facilitate transportation.
Transportation, yes.
They are amazing. Thank you. Yes. We face challenges up here that maybe you wouldn't realize not living here, maybe some other people. But something like GPS.
Right,
really
doesn't work,
here.
yeah.
That stops at the West Disney line. Programming in other towns, we love it.
Right,
Susan is one of our greatest ambassadors to go to Chilmark and Aquina.
yeah,
To take an employee
right,
to Aquina is not a 1 hour lunch, it's a 4 hour a day
Yes.
to do that.
yes,
And that's wonderful, and we're all loving doing it.
yes,
But the challenges up here are based on distance,
yep,
communication, and as far as people needing us, you would be shocked at the ages that need us. First of all, the minute anybody turns 60, they're thinking about that 65 bill. Oh my God, I need Social Security, I need Medicare, I need, boom, they're with us.
They're in,
never even thought
yeah.
of us. Oh my God, I'm having an operation, I need a walker, I need a wheelchair, I need a this. There's not a lot of places on the
Sure.
planet to go for this,
right,
besides us.
right,
So I think that with the limited resources we've been given, this team gives 1,000%.
Absolutely.
And I applaud each and every one of the board members and COA members. I think you're all fabulous.
I agree, I concur.
You're lifesavers. You've saved me many times. And today. I did. I'm in between, I'm taking care of them.
Yes,
So,
yes, so you're a caregiver and,
get it.
yeah,
but I will be curious to see how this goes, and then the idea of multi-generation, because it's a weird thing to be in the sandwich generation. And then be thinking about what do you want to help, what do you want to see moving forward? And what is it that life here has been a rhythm my whole life. I don't know what a new experience in the island would be like. And that is a factor for some of us.
sure.
That we
Yeah, change.
grew up interacting with the island and community in a certain way. And the house pushes some of that. Introduces new things that can be just not part of the way we've been thinking before. And I mean, I also acknowledge we're shrinking, those of us that have a lifelong connection are shrinking, which also is an interesting component.
Yes, yeah, there's a changing rhythm of people's lives, there's a changing rhythm of the communities, and how all of that kind of comes together is going to be an interesting thing. And I guess I would end by saying that I think we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the dedication of the staff and the board for getting us here, and this is really a milestone, I think, in terms of their investment and their planning and their preparation for moving this forward so that House is doing the best that it can for the communities that it serves. And I encourage you all to stay involved and stay, engaged in the process. And I thank you for coming out on this beautiful evening to listen to the results.
Thank you.
Thank you.